Okay, your quiz on the Week 8 homework assignment will contain 5 questions. One of the questions will be GCF, or greatest common factor. One of the questions will be DOPS, or the difference of perfect squares. One will be trinomial easy, one will be trinomial AC, and one will be grouping, not necessarily in that order. The directions will not tell you which method to use for each question, so you need to know when each method applies and how to carry out the process for each method. So I'm going to go over 5 examples from page 88 in the Week 8 homework assignment that will show you how to determine when and how to use each of these methods. Okay, so first starting off with GCF. You use GCF first. It's the first type of factoring you are always going to check for, and you can only apply the GCF method if there is a GCF to take out in your problem. If the terms in your expression do not have common factors, you can't use the GCF method, but you're always going to check for that first. If it doesn't have a GCF, what you're going to do is count your terms. If there are 2 terms, it's going to be DOPS as long as you have the difference of perfect squares set up, but you will on the quiz. If there are 3 terms, you're going to determine between whether it's going to be trinomial easy or trinomial AC. Trinomial easy is when there is a 1 in front of your x squared. Trinomial AC is when there is any other number in front of your x squared. And the only method we didn't mention so far is grouping. Grouping is the one that has a setup of 4 terms. Okay, so we're going to start off on, again, page 88 on the Week 8 homework assignment, question 301. So like I said, the first type of factoring you always want to check for is GCF. For 301, this one actually is GCF. I look at my 3 terms, 9x squared, 18x, and 27x cubed, and I know that 9 goes into all 3 of those numbers, and they also have an x in common. So I am going to use the GCF method, simply because that expression has a GCF. Okay, so to actually carry out the GCF process, I know that my GCF is 9x, so I'm going to divide all 3 terms in this expression by that GCF of 9x. And then in your next step, you bring down the 9x and follow it with a parentheses. Inside of the parentheses is going to be what you get when you divide. So these 9 divided by 9 in the beginning will cancel out or otherwise get you a 1. And then x squared divided by x, try and think about it as having x times x on top over an x. One of those sets of x's will cancel out and just leave you with an x or a 1x. Okay, then you have negative 18 divided by 9, which is a negative 2. These x's completely cancel out. Then the next one, I have 27 divided by 9, which is 3. And then x cubed over x is going to be 3 x's on top, 1 x on the bottom, and once that cancels out, leaving me with 2 x's, or in other words, x squared. And that is your answer for GCF factoring. You know, on your quiz, if you did that GCF factoring question already, you wouldn't have to check the other 4 questions on the quiz for GCF because you've already done that method. But I'm going to show you how to go about checking the next ones for GCF anyway, just so you're clear in case GCF is not the first question on your quiz. So for 302, I would check to see if it has a GCF first. Between 64 and 9, there's no number other than 1 that goes into those 2 numbers, and I have x's in the one term and y's in the other term, so they don't have a variable in common either, so that's not DOPS. I've checked that off my list. Now I need to count my terms. This one has 2 terms, which generally goes along with DOPS, but I also have to check for the DOPS setup. Difference means subtraction, so I do have subtraction, and the 2 terms in this expression are perfect squares, so this one is set up to go through the DOPS process. Okay, here's how you go about doing the difference of perfect squares. You start by taking the square root of both of your terms. The square root is simply asking you what number times itself will get you the number that's under the square root. Okay, now when I follow through with my DOPS process, it's always going to have the same setup, 2 sets of parentheses, 1 with a plus and 1 with a minus. Never ever change the signs with DOPS. It's always 2 opposite signs. Then you take the square root of each of those terms and place them in the blanks. So first one is 64x squared. The square root of 64x squared is going to be 8x. So I put an 8x in the front of both sets of those parentheses. The next one is the square root of 9y to the fourth. The square root of 9y to the fourth is 3y squared. So I put 3y squared at the back end of both of those sets of parentheses. Remember, when you're taking the square root of a variable, you cut its exponent in half. Half of 4 is 2. That's why the square root of y to the fourth is y squared. And that's all there is to DOPS. Okay, next one for 303. I know I'm supposed to check for a GCF first. 303 has 3 terms, but they don't have any term in common or any GCF. So I'm just going to go ahead and count my terms. I already did. It has 3, so this is definitely going to be a trinomial method. But I have to figure out if it's trinomial easy or trinomial AC, and it all depends on the number in front of x squared. This one has a 1 in front of the x squared, so it is trinomial easy. So to start trinomial easy, what you do is you take the number that's by itself with no variable, which in this case is a negative 12, and you write it off to the side. Disregarding that negative for now, I'm just going to list the factors of 12 underneath that number. So 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. Now I need to keep in mind that to multiply to a negative number, it needs to be a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive. But either way, I need opposite signs. So I know all of those factors underneath that negative 12 will somehow multiply to 12. I also need to pick the pair that adds to the middle number in my trinomial, which is a 1. Okay, so 1 and 12, if I add them together with a positive negative, it will in no way get me to a positive 1. Neither will 2 and 6, so those two pairs don't work. I'm going to work with the pair 3 and 4. Now I know a positive 3 and a positive 4 is not going to work in either way because it doesn't multiply to negative 12 and it doesn't add to positive 1. I know I need to put a negative somewhere. That negative is going to go on the 3. Here's why. My two possibilities were negative 3 and a positive 4, or a positive 3 and a negative 4. When you add negative 3 and positive 4, you get the positive 1 that you're looking for. A 3 plus a negative 4 is going to get you a negative 1, and that's not what I'm looking for. I have a positive 1 as my middle term. So my pair that I'm choosing is negative 3 and positive 4. Because this is trinomial easy, all you have to do is set up your two sets of parentheses. X goes in the front of both of them, and I have a negative 3 with one of the x's and a plus 4 with the other one. If you wrote x plus 4, x minus 3, that is also correct. And this is your final answer. All right, next one for 304. First thing I'm supposed to check for is a GCF. All 4 of those terms do not share a common greatest factor. So I'm going to then count the terms. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. 4 terms tells me right away that I'm going to do grouping. You know, the grouping factoring method starts by grouping the first 2 terms together and grouping the second 2 terms together. Make sure that this parentheses right here has the negative included in it. Once you have your grouping done, you're going to take the GCF out of each group. So out of my first group, where I have an Rn and a 5n, the GCF is n, so I'm going to divide an n out from both of them, and then just like regular GCF factoring, you take that n, bring it down, and follow it with a parentheses, and now you're going to divide. Alexa, cancel. Sorry, my Alexa alarm. Okay, so then I divide by n. These n's cancel out and leave me with an r. These n's also cancel out and leave me with a plus 5. So I'm left with r plus 5 when I take an n out. Okay, I'm very close to having an r plus 5 in the next one. The problem is they're both negative. Hopefully you remember from class that whatever you have right here needs to match up with whatever you end up with in the parentheses for your next one. So I need this to be an r plus 5. Well, right now it's not. My GCF is going to have to be a negative 1 in order to make that happen. When I take out a negative 1, I have negative r divided by negative 1, which gets me this r right here. A negative 5 divided by a negative 1 gets me this positive 5 right here. And they do end up matching up, which tells me that I'm right at this point. So that I'm ready to write my answer. Because those match up, what you do to write out your answer is bring it down, but only once in your answer. So I have r plus 5 in my answer. Now that those are gone, I take what I'm left with, which is an n and a negative 1, and I put them together as n minus 1. And that's my final answer. All right, one more that I'm going to do with you on this video, because this next one is just another trinomial easy, which you can practice on your own. I just want to go over one of each type of factoring with you. Okay, so 305. What you would do if this was your quiz is see if it has a GCF. 4, 13, and 10 do not have a greatest common factor, so GCF doesn't work for this one. I then go on to count my terms. There are 3 terms, so this is another trinomial. However, you then have to figure out if it's trinomial easy or trinomial AC. Because of this 4 in front of the x squared not being a 1, that makes this trinomial AC. Now, AC tells you your first step in solving this or factoring this. You're going to take A and multiply it to C. Remember, these trinomials are written as ax squared plus bx plus c. So A is that first term in front of x squared, and c is that number on the end that's by itself. So A times C for this problem is going to be 4 times 10. You're going to take that number and write it off to the side. 4 times 10 gets me 40. Then I need to list the factors of 40 off to the side, just like I did for easy trinomial. 1 times 40, 2 times 20, 4 times 10, and 5 times 8. Remember what your overall goal is here. You're trying to multiply to 40, which could either be a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, because you're multiplying to get a positive answer. And you're also trying to pick the pair that adds to negative 13, that number in the middle of the trinomial over here, negative 13. Okay, the only pair that will in some way add to this negative 13 is 5 and 8. But a positive 5 and a positive 8 will add to positive 13. I need this to be a negative 5 and a negative 8, because negative 5 plus negative 8 is equal to negative 13. Okay, now this is not trinomial easy. I can't do x minus 5, x minus 8, like I did in the trinomial easy one up there. I need to write this out so that it becomes a grouping problem. Now we just went over grouping. Grouping has 4 terms. So in order to set this up with 4 terms, you're going to first bring down the first term, 4x squared. Then you're going to split up that middle negative 13x into the 2 numbers that you picked off to the side, minus 5x, minus 8x, and then you bring your plus 10 down. You did not change the value of anything in this trinomial. All you did was set it up so that it now has 4 terms. You're almost like unsimplifying the problem by expanding that minus 13x into 2 terms. But again, now you have 4 terms, so you're good to move on with this grouping setup. Okay, so in each group for this grouping method, you're going to take the GCF of each group. So my first group has 4x squared and 5x. The GCF there is going to be x. So I'm going to take an x out of both of them, write that down in front, and then divide. 4x squared divided by x is 4x. And a negative 5x divided by x, the x's cancel and leave me with a negative 5. Okay, then my next group has a negative 8x and a positive 10. Remember what I told you about this negative being here. It gives you the hint that your GCF is going to be negative. If you didn't remember that, give this a try. Your GCF between 8x and 10 is going to be 2. If I take a 2 out of negative 8x, it's going to leave me with a negative 4x, and that's not going to match up with what I need it to match up with. So that gives me the big hint that I need to change the sign of my GCF to be a negative 2. Then I divide. Negative 8x divided by negative 2 is going to get me the positive 4x that I need, and positive 10 divided by negative 2 is going to be the negative 5 that I need it to be to make sure that those match up. Now that they match up, I'm going to do just like what I did with 304. I'm going to bring down the 4x minus 5. That did match up, and then I'm going to put my two GCFs together, x minus 2, and that's going to be my answer for this trinomial AC method. Okay, so a couple of helpful hints on top of that information that may or may not be helpful to you. Trinomial easy, going back to 303 for a second. Trinomial easy is just a shortcut for trinomial AC. If you're struggling to figure out when to do easy and when to do AC, AC always works. So if you are, like I said, struggling to figure out whether you do easy or AC, you can always resort back to AC, but easy doesn't always work. Easy is the shortcut that only works when A is 1. Okay, so if on your quiz you don't want to have to remember which type of trinomial to use, you can just do trinomial AC all the time. So I'll show you real quick what that would look like for this easy method up here, or this easy problem I should say. Okay, so if I redid this one, this x squared plus x minus 12 using AC instead, because again, AC will also work. You have a 1 in front here, so A times C is going to be negative 12. So you would still list your factors of 12 off to the side. And then you need to pick the pair still that adds to a positive 1. That's also still going to be a negative 3 and a positive 4. But if you're using that AC method, you would set it up as bringing down your first term, splitting up that middle term into a minus 3x plus 4x, and then bringing down that last term, and then going through and using grouping. So group the first two terms together and the second two terms together, and then GCF each group. So my first group has an x squared and a 3x, which makes my GCF x. So I take that x and I write it out in front. X squared divided by x is x, and 3x divided by x with that minus sign is going to get me a negative 3. Then I do the GCF of my next group. 4x and 12 has a GCF of 4. So the 4 comes down in front. When you divide, those 4's cancel and leave you with an x. And negative 12 divided by 4 is a minus 3. And you'll notice that these match up. When you bring down the one that matches up, x minus 3, that's gone now. And then you put your two GCFs together for the other one, x plus 4. And you'll notice that you get the exact same answer. It's a lot more steps, but if, again, you know what you're struggling with. If you are struggling with trying to figure out which trinomial to use, just use AC. It will work every time. It's a couple extra steps, but again, it works every time. Okay. One last thing that I'd like to remind you of for all of these problems, this entire quiz can be checked. You can check every single question on this quiz by foiling. So I'm just going to go ahead and check this last one to show you how to do a check, and that'll be the last thing I show you for this video. So on a check, all you do is take the answer that you get, rewrite it, and then FOIL it out. Remember, FOIL stands for first, outer, inner, last. So the first things I'm going to multiply together to check this are my two first terms, which is 4x and x. 4x times x, first do your 4 times 1, which is 4, and x times x is x squared. That takes care of my first. Then I do my outer. My two outer terms are 4x and negative 2. 4x times negative 2 is a minus 8x, and that takes care of my O in FOIL. Next I have I, which stands for inner. My two inner terms are negative 5 and positive x. Negative 5 times x is just negative 5x. That takes care of my inner. And then last is your two last terms in both sets of parentheses. Negative 5 times negative 2 is going to get me a plus 10, and that takes care of my last. Now you're trying to make sure it matches back up with what you started with for this problem in 305. It's almost there. You just have to simplify it by combining like terms. So the 4x squared comes down. Negative 8x minus 5x is negative 13x. And then you bring down the positive 10, and it does check out. So the checks don't take too long. It's definitely worth your time to make sure that you check every single question on your quiz to guarantee yourself that 20 out of 20. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you want, we didn't talk too much about it in class, But this Teach Me How to Factor YouTube link at the bottom of your notes and the bottom of your homework assignment on this page 88 is just a fun video song that goes over the different types of factoring. If you want to check that out, it might help you, study a little bit more in a fun way. If you do have any questions while you're studying, please feel free to email me, and good luck studying.